Hello, my name is Moshe Shulman from Judaism's Answer, and I just want to introduce you to these series of informal talks that we're having from my dining room, my living room, about various issues involving Judaism and how we deal with some of the claims made by Christianity. I've been involved in Kiruv, which is teaching people about Judaism for at least 20 years, and a lot of my work in this last 20 years has actually been involved in countering some of the things that Christians say involving Jewish works and Jewish and distortions of Judaism that they have. So who am I really trying to talk to right now? Actually, I'm trying to talk to you, every person that's out there. But specifically, I have in mind those Jews who have already become followers of Christianity or Messianic Judaism, whatever they want to call it. I also have in mind to try and explain things for those people who have been exposed to some of the missionary works that are out there, and to try and give them an idea of the other side of the story, basically. And finally, I'm interested in giving information for those of you who are interested in the subject from the Jewish point of view, who are Jewish themselves, just to give you some kind of an idea of really the basics and fundamentals of why Christianity's claims, and especially Messianics who claim that Judaism believes the same way, why they're wrong. So basically what we're going to do here is this. We're going to try and understand what Judaism believes and why. We are going to also, by the way, deal with materials that appear in missionary works. For example, Dr. Michael Brown has a number of books and lectures. And there's others that are around that we'll try and deal with. And finally, when you finish with all of these talks that we're going to have, you yourself will be totally prepared to realize anything that missionaries say, why it's wrong. You may not be able to convince a missionary, but you yourself will certainly know what is wrong with what they have to say. Now, what I plan on doing is just having very informal talks with you on subjects. I'm going to try and keep the length of this around 10 minutes, certainly no longer than 30. If the subject matter is a little bit longer, I'll divide it into different sections to make this easy to listen to in a very short amount of time. I'm going to try and divide this in a very logical manner, pretty much like Dr. Brown divides his books, which I think is a very logical manner. I'm going to give a few introductory talks about various issues. Following that, I'm going to get into the issues of what he calls general objections, and these are general things that Judaism has problems with Christianity about in general. Following that, we'll deal with historical issues, then theological issues, things about the New Testament, that messianic prophecy issues, then things in the New Testament. Finally, we're going to talk about Judaism and its traditions and oral law. Now, in order to discuss any of these things, I find it necessary to give introductions, some introductory ideas about Judaism which relate to these things, which you will not necessarily find addressed or even acknowledged in works like Brown or other missionaries. So, for example, we will eventually deal with the issue of Judaism and oral law. And in that, I'm going to have an introduction to it, and among the other things that we'll discuss about is exactly what the oral law is. You'll find that the Christians and Messianics, people like Brown, have a caricature of what the oral law is. Really has no relationship with what it really is. Now, what I would like to do is I would like to very strongly encourage you, those of you listening to this, that if you have questions of anything that comes up, you should send me an email with the question. I hope to gather some of these questions, and from time to time we'll actually go through each of these questions, discuss them out, and explain the answers. We have an email address, which is projecttorahtruth@gmail.com. That's projecttorahtruth@gmail.com. And you can send it there, and we will answer any questions that you have. Now, before addressing some of these discussion issues, these issues for our general discussion here that we have to go through before we can actually address Brown, I'd like to mention in passing here some general problems we're going to find continually when we do address and when we look into material that's brought by missionaries. One thing is that it's missing lots of issues. It does not really address many fundamental things from our Tanakh, the Jewish Bible, and Judaism that would give a person a totally different perspective on any of these issues. And that's one of the reasons why, before I even address some of the issues that Brown or other missionaries say, I will be giving introductory talks on just various different kinds of issues that relate to this and will help us to understand why they are so far off. Another thing is that when we read some of the things that the missionaries say, they have a very distorted view. This comes primarily because they have a incomplete knowledge of the Tanakh and Jewish teachings. They look at it in a different way, and actually we're going to cover this in the next two talks, which will deal with these issues. But they come from it in a certain way which makes it that their perspective is totally incomplete. And finally, of course, another thing that we're going to find is that they have biases. Now, of course, all of us have biases when we come into it, but when we discuss this, we'll see that the biases come from a position that actually contradicts from the Tanakh and from what Judaism has always believed. Now, I want to make two other important points, and then we can really start on our adventure with these talks. The first thing is that we will be dealing with a lot of things that are in the Tanakh, which is the Jewish Bible, another name for the Jewish Bible. The Christians call it the Old Testament, which is not such a very good name, but that's what they do. I will be using, in general, an art scroll, Tanakh, the stone edition. It's very, very popular. In fact, you find that a lot of Messianics actually use it also. I'll use it in general when I'm trying to translate things or bring a translation. The only time I will break that rule is when we are really dealing with a verse and we need to know what the verse is actually saying in the original language. And many times translations into English, for example, they lose the nuance of the language. So when we deal with things that we really need to know clearly what the verse says, then I will have to go into it and I'll actually do my own translations for a lot of it, or use different translations that I think are closer to it. But in general, I would say 90% of the time we will just be going through the art scroll translations and almost verbatim using that. And if you look into your own translation, if it's a different one, it probably won't be much different, but you should know that I'm using the art scroll. Finally, I'm trying to keep these discussions, these talks, a little bit informal. On my website called judaismsanswer.com, there are a number of articles that I have there that are dealing with issues that I'm going to bring up here, but they're in much more depth. And in order to keep this easier for you who are watching this to understand what I'm trying to say, I will summarize what's there, give a little bit of the points when I discuss about it, but really point you there to things that are much more in depth. So, for example, I have a very in-depth article dealing with Daniel 9 and chronology. I have an article there dealing with Josephus and what he says about Jesus. We'll discuss there much more deeply and much more intense. If you have an interest in that, you look there to follow up. But in these talks, we'll mention it, and I'll point out what I say there, and those of you who have an interest to look at it more should just look there. Okay, I think that we should stop this little introduction now, and the next talk that we're going to have is going to start us on our adventure of exploring the issues regarding Judaism, what it believes about the Messiah, and those issues and why we don't believe or agree with what the Christians and the Messianics say. Okay, thank you.